India, especially in the first two phases of the lockdown that was imposed pan-India, with virtually no consultation with the state governments, and all pervasive notifications and guidelines they were issued by the union, strictly falling within the domain of these states, and that also paralyzed the state finances. But I think due to the vertical checks and balances, gradually inputs were sought from states through prime minister's video conferencing with chief ministers, signifying the spirit of cooperative federalism. And so far, five such meetings have taken place to discuss the gravity of the situation, preparedness, extension of the lockdown, various interpretations of centers norms by the states to open up sectors to boost agriculture, manufacturing, reduce skilled workers, migrants, health workers movements, devolution of funds, etc. But especially, I would say that lockdown 4 was very different from the earlier phases because the guidelines issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs that gave a large amount of autonomy to the state governments, including classification of red, orange, and green zones. But there are other issues, and this was one of the issues which was raised by the Chief Minister of West Bengal. But there are new kinds of issues that have come up, and states are competing among themselves. We have seen in last couple of days the what happened in Mumbai. Now another important point that I would like to make is that with regard to COVID-19 in India, like in many other federal countries, including USA, which has been worst hit, it has been mainly the phenomenon of executive federalism that has been in evidence. So legislative federalism as well as judicial federalism, they have been weak, they have been weak in the entire process. So legislature is completely missing from the scene. Judiciary, I would say, in case of India, initially it showed some reluctance with regard to spurt of PILs regarding violation of rights of migrants and all, but belatedly it came into picture, and there have been instances where judiciary asked, the private labs to provide free COVID tests for poor who have been covered under Modi Care. And then it was because of the role of the Supreme Court that MHA, Minister of Home Affairs, had to withdraw notification regarding compulsory salaries, payment of salaries and wages to workers during lockdown. And with regard to gender justice, it played a very important role, especially the Jammu and Kashmir Chief Justice Geeta Mittal and Justice Rajneesh Oswal. They issued a number of directions during the COVID-19 to protect women's safety and security from domestic violence. So I would say it has been mainly the executive branch that has been more powerful in this entire process. Now, in majority of the federal countries, including India, as my colleague Alok pointed out, constitution lists healthcare as responsibility of the state governments. But during the pandemic situation, when citizens' life is at stake, the central government takes an upbeat role, especially in event of lockdown that produces different kinds of challenges. Now, since economic and social planning is the subject in the concurrent list in the central government, it's the central government's responsibility, which is taking, for overall management of economy amidst this lockdown. Now, in this regard, there are two important acts that need to be mentioned. My colleague mentioned about one of it. I think it's important to talk about the Epidemic Disease Act, also 1897, which is a central law in India, which constitutionally empowers both the central and the state governments to regulate the spread of the epidemic diseases. Now, in light of this, state of Karnataka, that was the first one that imposed this act on March 11. And learning from this, many other states, Haryana, Maharashtra, Delhi, Goa, they also implemented this in their own, within their own territories. And then the central government also asked all these states to invoke provisions of Section 2 of this act regarding enforceable character of advisories of the Union Health Department and the state governments. So this act clearly divides the powers between the two levels of the government. Then another act which my colleague mentioned was about disaster management, which is not in any of the lists, but the Parliament of India is empowered to legislate on this subject, which can be said to be a residuary power. So this Disaster Management Act, that was brought out in 2005, through entry 23 of the concurrent list, namely social security, social insurance, employment, and unemployment. Now, the central government has also, I would say, taken many sustained measures for with regard to widening the test criteria for virus through private labs and all. But states have also, taken a very important step, and they have tried innovative ways of dealing with this crisis, and especially, and many other states have followed this. Even the center has followed some of the this examples taken by the state governments. Like Kerala announced economic package of 20,000 rupees on March 19. This was the first state to do so in India. And after a week, it was the central government that announced, rupees 1.7 lakh crore financial package. Then another state, Orissa, before the virus cases started surfacing in the state, they reached out to the people in smaller towns and villages and asked them who have returned home since the outbreak of the COVID, to stay in home quarantine. So these have been some important, innovative ways, and which was followed by other states and also center. And as Alok mentioned, the role of district administration has been very crucial in this, and especially the Bhilwara district model, which I talked about in my article also, which is published by Forum, and Agra model. They were much in discussion. They were considered to be successful models, but then Agra model failed. Initially it was successful, but towards the end, later stated it failed. Now, India was appreciated, across the world for that has managed quite well considering its vast population and population density. But there have been several criticisms regarding the way this lockdown was imposed, and number of cases are increasing over the years, and India has crossed, over a lakh cases, and 3,435 deaths have taken place according to Ministry of Health, data. So I think the current arrangement could have been dealt in a better way, and they have, if the center had consulted the states from the very beginning, and to some extent I feel it was mismanaged, and center could have given some more time rather than doing it in a sudden manner. They could have allowed the industry, manufacturers, migrants to take an alternative kind of arrangements, and allowed people to get back to their homes. Students are stuck in universities, and there's millions lost their income. There's food shortage, uncertainty about the future, hunger. Thousands started walking back home, without any transport. But then finally, the center and the states, provided for transportation. So I think it could have been better administered. And then another point that I would like to make is that it is important that
sorry, we're a little bit running out of time.
Yeah, I'll just conclude. So there was need to transfer funds from Prime Minister's cares and Prime Minister's relief fund to state governments, depending on their population and intensity of this spread of the virus. Moreover, contributions to the Chief Minister's fund should also be given some kind of income tax rebate. And final point, I would say that instead of having informal conferences, video conferences with Chief Ministers, there was need to activate the forum of Interstate Council, which is a constitutional forum, and a standing committee of the Interstate Council could have been set up to deal with this situation. So to conclude, I would say that irrespective of the distribution of the roles and responsibilities, all the levels of the governments, they are required to work in close coordination with each other, demonstrating the spirit of cooperative federalism in order to deal with the current crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those perspectives from India. For our next country case, we're moving on to Germany, where I'm happy to introduce, first of all, Professor Gerd Milbrat, who is currently a professor at the Technical University of Dresden. But of course, like many other people on this panel, he has also been active in actual politics because he has served as the Minister President of Saxony for over 10 years. And he was really pivotal there in shaping the fiscal policy in one of the new Länder. And I'd be really happy to hear his perspective on this topic. I'm also very grateful to introduce Professor Sabine Kropp, who currently holds the chair of German politics at the Freie Universität Berlin. She has, of course, published very widely on the manifold complexities of federalism, both in Germany, but also in beyond. She, in her former life, of course, also led a ministry in Saxony-Anhalt. So also she has actual policy experience. So again, we combine research and practical insights here. And I'm happy to open up the floor to both of you. Take it away.
Well, I begin with giving you some information on the constitutional allocation of powers within Germany. The Federation has concurrent legislative power to combat communicable diseases. On this basis, the Federation enacted an Infection Protection Act regulating the prevention and control of dangerous infections, the measures to fight them, and the collection of data. The states generally execute federal laws in their own rights with only a mild form of supervision. The Infection Protection Act gives the states and the counties and big cities far-reaching competences to restrict even fundamental freedom rights if necessary. The counties and cities dispose of special health departments which are expected to take the necessary actions to prevent and repress infections. That includes monitoring, testing, tracking, and tracing, as well as closing businesses or schools, restricting movements and contacts of people. The state governments and their health ministries decide for the whole state and can instruct local departments. The main agency of the Federal Health Ministry is a special institute which provides scientific expertise in disease control and prevention, has a scientific network, collects data and publishes widely respected but not legal binding medical and behavioral recommendations. Medical care is provided by doctors and hospitals in different ownership. Based on contribution by employers and employees, the federal statutory health insurance system is funding these services, including, for instance, testing. We possess a dense hospital network with great availability of intensive care beds compared to our neighbors. The same is true for ventilators. And we have a competent net of labs and research institutes. The local authorities could cope with the first corona outbreaks in January and February because they had reliable tests at hand. As in early March, due to returning ski tourists, the detected infections rapidly increased. The states began to ban mass events, later smaller meetings, closed school and universities, implemented personal contact restrictions and social distancing, shut down restaurants, hotels, and retail shops, except essential businesses. However, manufacturing and most craft, as well as transport, remained open. Bavaria, the state of Bavaria, with many infections, began with these measures. Other states followed suit, some with hesitations, as the pandemic mainly affected the south and west of the country. The federal government gave advice by its institute, supported the states, particularly in procurement. The federal chancellor and the informal conference of state ministers, minister presidents, coordinated their actions in the shutdown period. Germany seems to have mitigated the first wave of the pandemic. The health sector has never reached its limits. After 6 weeks now, the process of gradual reopening is beginning. However, now states' policies are varying more and more according to different infection situations and political strategies. States and local governments are assuming their original responsibility. The Chancellor and the Minister Presidents only agreed on a ban of mass events till September, lighter social distancing rules, and an emergency clause in case of local spikes. The automatic instruments of our developed welfare state prevented a dramatic increase in unemployment and substantial income losses for the people so far. Additionally, a large support package was offered to help businesses to endure the partial shutdown. Here, the Federation plays the predominant role because of its responsibility for social security and the tax system. The federation is supporting the economy and big companies, whereas the states are concentrated on small and medium-sized enterprises and self-employed. Local governments are complementing the programs. The debt break, the constitutional debt break in Germany is suspended at the moment. So far, our decentralized system has fared relatively well so far, but legal instruments had to be improved. Another lesson on the European level, Europe needs faster reaction concerning the control of its external borders and more coordination when restricting inter-European travel and business and fighting the pandemic. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Sabine.
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to zoom in onto two aspects which I found especially interesting. This is the role on intergovernmental bodies for steering the pandemic on the one hand, and the question to what extent federalism can work as a framework enhancing yardstick competition for best practices on the other. So as to the first aspect, to the coordination by intergovernmental bodies, what we see is, Georg mentioned it already, that during the first phase, this was the lockdown, the federal government was just able to give recommendations to the Länder. These recommendations, however, became de facto binding because the Länder were unable to justify a significantly lower level of health security in their own territories. Some Länder, particularly Bavaria, which was affected by the virus, reacted more quickly and put others under pressure. And finally, this competition led to a similar level of restrictions across the country. This competitive mechanism was bolstered by public opinion, which expected governments to impose effective measures against the pandemic throughout the country. But there was definitely a need to adapt the law. The most important instrument to coordinate the federal units has been the conference of the minister presidents of the Länder with the chancellor. This forum is highly institutionalized and fixed in the standing order of the German federal government. It is, so to say, an embodiment of cooperative federalism. Compared to more informal forums or meetings, which are frequently described for other federations, I think this institutionalization can be regarded as advantageous because nearly no transaction costs need to be spent, no special organizational efforts are to be made, and in emergency situations, the body can easily be activated. So comity as an unwritten constitutional principle has shaped the interactions between the constituent units so far, but at the moment, this principle has somehow come under pressure. In the still ongoing second phase, this is the easing of the restrictions, the Länder have remained responsible for the lion's share of policy issues related to these easing measures. Most expectations that centralizing trends will prevail have not materialized. This will probably change during the third period. Georg Milbrat mentioned it already. At the moment, we can observe a remarkable competition between the Länder, which are outbidding themselves in their attempts to release the restrictions. Considering the German unitary culture, we can observe a striking debate on federal variation. And significantly, the conference of the minister presidents with the chancellor is no longer convened at the moment, at least for the next weeks, because there are severe conflicts about to what extent the restrictions can be relaxed or even given up, with Thuringer's left government being the forerunner at the moment. And the chancellor and the federal government has no authority to give instructions. Other Länder, by contrast, most prominently Berlin and Bavaria, have already demanded more coordinative responsibilities for the federal government, which should set obligatory standards throughout the country. I think it much depends on how fast the pandemic will be spreading in the course of the next months. This again has consequences for how the federal system works. Claiming autonomy, the prime ministers of the Länder can no longer shift responsibility to the arenas of joint decision-making. They run the risk of being made responsible for their decisions that are still based on shaky evidence. So basically, I think this is not a bad thing, because the parliamentary majorities in the German Landtage, the state parliaments, have the opportunity to hold their governments accountable and lead public debates. But we should remind ourselves of the fact that the German system of joint decision-making has been frequently criticized due to its dispersed competences. And now, looking into the media, it is criticized for generating the opposite. And the second aspect, federalism as a learning tool, there is another observation which I find particularly interesting. This is that governments at all levels employ their own experts and expert committees at the moment, and the whole process has been driven by experts and is at the same time shaped by different, often contested positions and shaky evidence. So this raises the question, to what extent can federalism be operated as a tool for policy learning? And does it enhance yardstick competition? Can it fulfill its tasks to serve as a laboratory for identifying the best or even worse practices? I think at least it has potential to fulfill this task, because the system allows for limited competition. This affects, for instance, the opening of kindergartens, of schools, etc. In fact, however, incumbents do not necessarily compete for the best solution. This is what we can observe also in the moment, because decisions are sometimes overshadowed by electoral logics, as the recent attempt of Thuringia's minister president, who will be facing a very difficult electoral campaign with the right-wing populist AfD as the main competitor, reveals. And one could also mention the role of the premier of North Rhine-Westphalia, who is competing for party leadership of the CDU at the moment. So there's a lot about politics as well. Even more, the negative consequences resulting from quick easing may also affect other constitutional units that are not responsible for the decision. And this is a classical example for burden shift in the federal system. And this, I think, well, brings us to some research questions, which on the one hand have frequently been addressed by research on federalism, especially by political economy on federalism, but on the other hand can now be reassessed in light of the crisis. Given that federalism works as an institutional structure enhancing opportunism, which is highlighted by some theories on federalism, what are suitable safeguards containing this behavior? And another question is, how can federalism be operated to secure social and political cohesion in this crisis? Well, I mean, considering Germany, I'm not too pessimistic, because the Länder must go back to the arenas of joint decision-making soon, especially when it comes to cope with the fiscal burden and federal programs, mainly in the sphere of social policies. But I think it's still an open question whether or not cooperative federalism will have the potential to tame such strategies. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these perspectives from Germany. I'm really looking forward to also contrasting the different experiences. But before we move to that, finally, we also like to invite some perspectives from Canada. First of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Chilton. He is the Ontario Research Chair in Health Policy and System Design with the University of Toronto, as well as Dr. Slack. She is the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting both of us here today. And I just wanted to say how much I've learned already from what has been presented in terms of putting my own country, Canada, into context. As many of you know, Canada is among the most highly decentralized federations in the world. One equivalent federation is Switzerland, but even based upon studies that have used actual measures across a number of domains, Canada has scored actually as a more decentralized federation today than Switzerland. And that does mean that Canada has moved dramatically in the last 40 to 50 years in the direction of decentralization. And we can certainly see that reflected in the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. The first thing to note is that it was the provincial and territorial governments that declared a state of emergency. To date, the federal government has not declared a state of emergency. And that is because the provincial and territorial governments are doing almost all of the heavy lifting when it comes to the kinds of measures, which I'll talk about in a second, the containment measures, testing, treatment, as well as some of the social measures in response to the crisis. And so it was natural that they took the emergency powers necessary to do that. However, it has been highly controversial as to whether the federal government should actually exercise such emergency powers. Now, let's go through some of the measures, because one area in which the federal government has been heavily involved is in the area of what I would call the economic measures in response to the crisis. And the federal government, in fact, introduced something called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CERB, which provides roughly about $2,000 a month to those who have to stop working due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that this is temporary relief available for up to 16 weeks. There's discussions right now as to whether that should be extended further. But let's move to the provincial and territorial governments, where most of the measures have been taken. And I just want to say, first of all, that in the area of containment, in the initial months of the crisis, this was an area in which the provincial and territorial governments, while there was some variation among them, there was a tendency to converge in terms of measures. There was even some copying. The edicts that came out through the aegis of the emergency acts were often similarly worded. There were clear directions that were provided through the various medical officers, the health in each province, that provincial governments adopted as sort of best practice in terms of containing COVID-19. But when it's come to opening up, which has begun to occur in the last couple of weeks, and the trajectory sounds very similar to Germany and even to some extent in India in terms of timing, but that opening up, as in the case of Germany, we once again see tremendous variation among the provinces, and that is in part because of the incidence of the disease. It's very unequally distributed across Canada, and it has been contained to various degrees of success and lack of success across the country as well. You have hotspots of Quebec in particular, but also Ontario, the two most urbanized and populated provinces. And then you have a situation in British Columbia, even though there's a large major city, where it's been very much more able to contain the pandemic. Then you have testing, and here diagnostic testing, there's been difficulties to reach targets in virtually every jurisdiction. difficulties getting the appropriate testing protocols in place, and the necessary supplies and the necessary personnel to do as much testing as the provincial governments would have liked. And this is going to become a real issue on antibody testing as jurisdictions open up. In terms of treatment, again, like Germany, there was never the pressure on acute care facilities that was anticipated. So intensive care units in hospital were not overwhelmed as many had predicted. There was assignment of certain hospitals to deal with COVID-19 patients to segregate them from the general populations. In terms of economic and social measures in the provinces, these varied considerably, of course, in particular the subsidies and to certain economic actors that varies depending on the nature of the provincial or regional economy. For example, the subsidies to the oil and gas industry in Alberta were very different than anything else done in the rest of the country. And in terms of the what I would call the provincial and territorial health authorities, they're playing a leading role as opposed to the Public Health Agency of Canada in providing the intelligence, the recommendations in terms of the measures to be taken. So now let me turn to joint decision-making. These are the intergovernmental institutions and processes. I've been following these very closely because it's, I think this crisis has produced a very interesting case study. And what you see are something new, a few old things, and some things that you don't see at all that we probably should have seen. Intergovernmental institutions and processes in Canada are almost entirely through executive federalism, and that is largely through federal, provincial, territorial government processes. So there's something new here. There's been a weekly call between the Prime Minister and the Premiers on COVID-19, and it's largely focused on what the federal government should do as opposed to collaborating on what all governments might be converging towards. So there was a fair amount of discussion about the possibility of the Emergencies Act being invoked by the federal government and a fair amount of opposition to that by provincial governments. And some discussion, some of it positive, some of it negative, about the economic measures taken by the federal government. There's limited reporting on this. Basically, all that comes out to the general public is what's leaked or what's discussed by first ministers after such meetings. So we have very little idea of the full content of these meetings. What's missing, and this is a little bit like Arthur Conan Doyle stories about the various Hound of the Baskervilles, et cetera. And that's sort of the difficulty of finding what has not occurred. But one thing I did a fair amount of searching on this and discovered that the Council of the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Ministers of Health have not met during this period. And by meeting, I mean through virtual meetings, nor have the Deputy Ministers of Health across the country met. There have been meetings of the Council of Ministers of, or the Council of the Medical Officers of Health. They have regular meetings. Again, these are not for public consumption, so we have very little idea as members of the public or the Academy as to what actually has occurred in those meetings and to what extent they've been used as a coordination mechanism. There has been an investment by the federal government in provincial and territorial health systems of $500 million, basically temporary assistance to fund test kits, et cetera, as well as the shortage of personnel, particularly in long-term care facilities where COVID-19 has struck particularly hard. Approximately 80% of all deaths due to COVID-19 have been connected to long-term care facilities in Canada. So, as I said, the provincial and territorial governments have not really requested very much from the federal government, but one exception is the request by both the governments of Ontario and Quebec for the Canadian military to provide its medical personnel to help out in long-term care facilities. A report just came out yesterday from the military on the terrible state of some of the facilities in Ontario, and another report will be coming shortly on Quebec. And there are many calls right now for the federal government to step in through regular sorts of shared cost arrangements to begin to set standards in long-term care. Whether this will become a distinct movement, we'll have to see. But there is a fair amount of outrage at the situation in long-term care in Canada at this point because of this report. Just like to say that, that the federal government has largely accepted its what I would call secondary role through the COVID-19 crisis. The provinces and territories have largely assumed they're in charge and have done a reasonable job in most areas, some exceptions, particularly long-term care, but they've done a fairly good job. And it's made a difference because in the case of the United States, as you all know, there were many states that were waiting for the federal government to play more of a leadership role. When they realized that that would not be forthcoming, they began to act on their own and take measures, but it was at times too late. And New York State offers one example of that. So that there is this, I think, fundamental difference between the two federations on that front. And there are advantages to understanding who's in charge at a time like this. And in Canada, I think the people of Canada benefited from the provinces understanding that they would be largely responsible for the heavy lifting in responding to the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Forum of Federations and the Free University of Berlin for inviting me to be on this panel. You know, it's a funny thing about a university. Greg and I both are at the University of Toronto. We've never met. we certainly didn't talk about our presentations today. So you're going to see some overlap, perhaps some similar ideas and some different ones. I'm going to focus a little more on the fiscal aspects, less on the health aspects. And because Greg hasn't talked much about local government, and that's what I do, I'll talk a little bit more about local government. I have three basic points I want to make. Greg has made one, which is Canada is one of the most decentralized countries in the world. But the federal government has taken on a major role, particularly on the economic side, largely because they have the fiscal capacity to do it. And I'll come back to that point. My second point is that responsibilities are entangled among all three levels of government. But we have seen unprecedented collaboration among the three orders of government in Canada. Will it last? We don't know. And my third point is that the pandemic highlights the need to rethink Canada's fiscal arrangements. Who does what, who pays for it? So let me start at the top. The federal government has been very involved in the economic impact of this crisis. They've taken a lead role in providing financial support for individuals and businesses that have been affected by the crisis. Greg mentioned one program. They've given small business loans, temporary wage subsidies, making business credit available, providing commercial rent assistance, which incidentally, they were able to negotiate with the provinces, working with them to bring that program forward, providing benefits to workers who've lost their jobs, tax deferrals. So they've been involved very much in the economy and trying to help people who are suffering from the impact of the crisis. In Canada, provincial governments are responsible for healthcare, education, public safety, social services, and long-term care. And so they, as Greg said, had the power to issue stay-at-home orders, which they did. The federal government has the power to invoke the Emergency Measures Act. They didn't do that. Each province did that themselves, asked the federal government not to get involved. The provinces have declared states of emergency. They've closed schools, closed restaurants, bars, shops, etc. And of course, each province is now determining how they're going to open up the economy. And they're doing it, as Greg said, at different rates, depending on where the state of infections is, how many deaths. And so they have to coordinate a little bit, but basically they're each doing their own thing on opening up the economy. Local governments are on the front lines. Local governments deliver essential services. They are in public health. They are in emergency services, social services. But then they also deliver all the services we need to have continue, whether it's a pandemic or not: policing, fire protection, transit, roads, water, recreation services, garbage pickup, recycling, all of these services that are on the front line. Local governments have imposed social distancing measures. They've made changes to public transit facilities because, of course, they need social distancing on these facilities. They need to clean them more frequently. They found additional spaces for the homeless population, largely by repurposing some municipal facilities. And then they have deferred property taxes and water bills to help people who really can't afford to pay these things right now. But municipalities are very limited. Of all the governments, they have the most limited revenue raising capabilities. In Canada, local governments have property taxes. That's the main source of revenue. 40 to 50% of their revenues come from property taxes. They have user fees, and they get some transfers, mainly from the provincial government, some federal transfers. They can borrow to make capital expenditures, but they cannot run an operating deficit. So all of these costs that they're incurring, and they're saving some money too, because some of their facilities are closed, but they're incurring extra costs and they're losing revenues. Some of these losses are temporary because they're property tax deferrals. Hopefully they'll eventually get them. But things like transit revenues, recreation user fees, these are lost. These are permanent losses of revenue. And they cannot borrow to meet these operating deficits. So they are financially in quite a lot of trouble. So my second point is that responsibilities are entangled. But we have seen incredible collaboration in the country. And it's actually heartwarming and surprising in some ways to see provincial premiers of different political parties praising the Prime Minister for what the Canadian government is doing, and vice versa, the Canadian Prime Minister praising the provinces. This is unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. But we don't know how long these good feelings are going to continue. And I think that leads to my third point, which is we really need to rethink Canada's fiscal arrangements. And a number of authors have called for an intergovernmental fiscal commission along the lines of the Royal Sirois report that came out in the 30s around the time of the Depression. The fiscal pressures on governments with critical responsibilities but not adequate revenues to fulfill those responsibilities are pretty serious. And as I mentioned, the problem is particularly acute for municipalities because they are paying for health and social services in some cases out of property tax revenues. Now, these are services that we're using to redistribute income from high-income households to low-income households. And we all know the property tax is not a very redistributive, it's not a progressive tax in the same way that the income tax is. And when the recovery comes, and municipalities are going to be looked to provide infrastructure, transit infrastructure and roads and other hard infrastructure, they are going to have a lot of difficulty providing the money for that, if they're trying to meet up their operating deficits, if they've dipped into their capital reserves to meet operating expenditures, this is going to be very difficult. Transit is a real problem in the large cities in Canada because that's a permanent loss of revenue. Those transit fare revenues are gone, and the municipalities are going to have to attract people back into the transit system. I'm not ready to get back on transit. There's got to be social distancing. There's got to be more cleaning. You've got to convince people to get on the system. So those transit revenues are going to be very slow to come back. And so it's really the fiscal pressures on municipalities are quite significant. So I think this is the perfect time to rethink the fiscal arrangements in Canada. We've got this crisis, but we also have this unprecedented goodwill among all orders of government. And I think that provides us with an opportunity. I always like to end on a positive note. I think it provides us with an opportunity to rethink intergovernmental fiscal relations in this country. Thank you.
I thank you very much for all your insights from everyone. We're unfortunately a little bit behind schedule. So I'm going to quickly move on to our two discussants. I'd like to ask everyone, though, to keep our contributions somewhat brief, so we also have some time to hear the questions from the audience at a later stage. Now, though, first of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Francesco Palermo. He's a professor of comparative public law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Verona, and also the director of the Institute of Comparative Federalism. And then afterwards, I'm going to introduce Professor Jared Sonicson, who is currently my colleague as a visiting professor at the Freie Universität Berlin. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you also on my side for inviting me to this very interesting panel. Let me, reduce my potentially numerous points to just two in order to save time. All the presentations have been extremely detailed and very precise in describing the situation of the respective country. I would like to try to bring the debate now on a comparative level. And the first point I have is a reflection. If we can borrow from a famous saying, we could just say that federal countries do it differently, right? Not necessarily better, but certainly differently. Because my feeling is that even if, of course, the reaction depends on a number of factors, and you have brilliantly highlighted them, like cultural elements, of course, and political, economic, and other elements, there is one thing in common, I feel, which is that the reaction in diversified countries is less hysterical, I would put it this way. There is less use of emergency powers in general. There is more coordination among the levels of government, and coordination doesn't mean obedience, or as the Prime Minister of the community of Valencia in Spain has just recently put it. You may have read that loyalty doesn't mean submission, right? So in countries that are missing this sort of a cooperative approach, then you have either conflict or just obedience or just imposition from the top down, which might be problematic. So there is a better culture of a differentiated approach, which is what actually this pandemic is telling us, because everywhere and all the countries you have been dealing with also demonstrate that the impact of the virus has been extremely asymmetric. There have been areas of the country that have been affected much more than others. And so the obvious response would be a differentiated one, which is not necessarily what the prevailing rhetoric is saying. Actually, in many countries, including in many federal countries, there is a first reaction in terms of saying, oh, why should we have different healthcare systems? Why should we have different regulations? We should rather go for a uniform regulation for all. So I think there is a moment now when we need to rethink the ways responses are given by constitutional systems. But that's the reflection. The second and final point is a question. I don't know, it's not for a specific speaker, but I would like to throw it on the floor. I think what we are certainly witnessing now is a constitutional moment. Rules are going to change in one direction or the other. Because of this pandemic and because of the fact that most of the constitutional systems were not entirely up to date in dealing with this sort of unexpected pandemic. Now, the question I would like to ask, and I conclude on that, is in which direction are we going? We are seeing tendencies in two opposite directions. On the one hand, and you have very often highlighted that, the recognition of difference, the recognition of a diversified approach, etc. But on the other hand, we also see trends towards authoritarianism, towards seizing the power from the territories on the one hand and from parliaments on the other hand. So the countries you've been discussing today are probably the exception if we take it a global perspective. So do you think that there will be a sort of a constitutional amendment in many countries? And if yes, in which direction is it going to go? And whether perhaps the federal scholars here could also provide a contribution in steering the debate into the right direction, which is that of appreciating the difference instead of celebrating undifferentiated and unitary responses. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your reflections. Maybe we can solicit some reactions from the panelists first, and then we move on to Jared's reflections and questions as well. So if anyone has a thought on this, feel free to chime in now. Greg.
Just very quickly, and I don't know how many people are thinking this, a few are, but in the case of Canada, the idea of an amendment to the Federal Emergencies Act that would deal with the question of pandemics, and the idea that, in fact, the federal government does have a more of a leadership role to play in the case of a pandemic than in other sorts of emergencies, and that if there was some failure, it was, in fact, that failure to provide what was necessary for the country as a whole in terms of common data, for example, as well as ensuring testing supplies, et cetera, for the country as a whole. So in very specific areas and invoking it in a very delimited way and for that, for those purposes only.
Yeah. Can I?
Professor Alok, go ahead, and then I have Professor Saxena next.
Two aspects, very briefly. First is, can we go for any kind of a change in the constitutions? This pandemic, we are trying to solve this problem through a Disaster Management Act. There is no provision in the Constitution for disaster management. There is an emergency provision in the Constitution, which was invoked about 40 years ago, that has been deleted. That is the internal disturbances. It's Article 352 that has been deleted. So there is no point of changing any clause of the Constitution because of this pandemic. That's response number one. Response number two is about public health, harmonization of public health across states. In India, the public health is shared between the states and the local government, and there is a huge variations across the states. So this is very difficult to harmonize that kind of systems here in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Saxena, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I just want to add that I agree with what Francisco said about this concern for this, whether we are moving towards great authoritarianism because of the increasing power of the executive. But I think this system of, in case of India, this system of checks and balances, vertical checks and balances is playing very important role. And judiciary, as I mentioned, that of course the trend all over the world has been that this crisis has been handled by executive federalism. But there are some previously available laws which have been used in case of India. So it is okay for the legislature to be unnecessary to unnecessarily come into the picture. But in case of Australia, if you see, there was they have brought about this new legislation especially for dealing with the current pandemic. But then judiciary has been playing the role of checks and balance, as I mentioned during my presentation, that because of the intervention of judiciary, the MHA had to take back its notification. And so judicial activism, judiciary is playing a more proactive role belatedly in case of India. So we have this system of checks and balance, but then because of overlapping concerns in our federal system, these problems may arise in future as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other thoughts or reflections on this? Yes, Professor Milbert.
I think in Germany, a constitutional amendment is not necessary because most of the financial problems concerning the fight of the pandemic, the health expenditures are covered by the social security system, and there's an equalizing system. And the second is the same applies for some of the economic problems concerning unemployment. Because of our unemployment system, there was an automatic response to pay those who have lost work. That does not mean under German law lost employment, get compensation payments, and therefore this was financed out of this social security system, which originally ran a surplus. So at the moment there is not this problem. But what was mentioned concerning local governments, I think that is an issue in Germany too, because one of the main taxes of local businesses is the business tax. It's a profit tax. And because the profit tax has big variations concerning to the business cycle or the business climate, the tax incomes of local governments are very low at the moment, and therefore I think there is a special rescue package by the states, maybe by the federation as well, but by the states who are responsible for local governments to compensate part of the losses in the tax income. Therefore, I think that should be included in the rescue packages in Germany as well. Our main problem is that up to now, all these rescue packages add up to 15% of GDP. And it will be very difficult to cope with this increased debt in the future. I think there will be some new elements concerning the constitution as well, concerning future debt management.
Thank you so much. One last comment. Yes, Dr. Clark.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the local government thing that George was mentioning in Germany. In Canada, the federal government has, as I said, given a lot of programs to individuals and businesses, and municipalities are saying that they need, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has said they need $10 to $15 billion to cover their operating deficits. And they've looked to the federal government. And this is actually one place where the federal government is saying, oh, that's a provincial responsibility. And the provinces are saying, oh no, we don't have the money. The federal government needs to come in. And they're going back and forth, and nothing has come of it yet. But it will be interesting to see if there will be a rescue package for municipalities. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, there are already quite a few questions from the audience regarding actually precisely sort of the financial side of things. So maybe we can actually explore that in a minute. But Jared, if you will.
Okay, thank you very much. Really quick, thank you to everybody, also from my side, former federations. Crystal, thanks for moderating, and thanks for these excellent contributions. Like Francesco, I want to keep it very short, and so I need to throw away all of these notes I've taken, and I'll do a quick reflection and a question that I would invite any of the panelists to respond to. The quick reflection is, and I say in no false modesty that this is not original, but one thing that I'm thinking of is a wide spectrum. The one hand is this coronavirus pandemic should be showing us on one extreme that federalism is more irrelevant than ever. We're facing a challenge that crosses borders, nationalities, and all of these things. So why federalism? Well, do we not even need more centralization and a global, some sort of international government perspective? That's the one extreme. On the other hand, we see, and I took some notes, particularly what Professor Slack was listing. Look at all of the responses, all the areas that need to respond then to actually dealing with this, and they're all, local, lower level. Typical examples of where subsidiarity would be applicable. And not just health and public policy, but all these other things that get that are tangents to it: police, education, hospitality, gastronomy, you name it. Everything has to be resolved at a local level. So we're back to, at the same time, I think, actually the real answer is how incredibly relevant federalism is right now, to give maybe, I guess, a sort of reflection, food for thought, for whatever that's worth. But so now the question of the panels, I find myself wondering, and a couple of you have pointed out to that, this could be a chance for changes. Crises are sort of the typical critical juncture where we think about, okay, what do we learn from this and what do we change? But I would like to prompt a different question, and namely, what have we learned about so far, what we're seeing? Crises and critical junctures, drawing what I know, at least from comparative federalism, is that they often show us some of the limits too, and some of the, to overdo it, maybe some of the pathologies, some of the defects that have developed, and certainly, to be more neutral, some of the asymmetries we have in the political system, right? Or at least somehow the way things have developed so far. So I wonder how you see antecedent developments playing out. In the German case, has some of the way German cooperative federalism played out for allowing more now room for the states, or quite the opposite, joint decision making that's without it being obligatory. In the Canadian and Indian cases, we don't have formal joint decision systems, but various shades of somehow vertical and horizontal cooperation taking place. There was a breakdown in Canada beforehand under Harper in particular of intergovernmental relations. Is that changing now? Did that start beforehand? And in a similar case with India, do we see party differentiation? I think I remember Professor Saxena mentioned the example of Kerala, but Kerala was beforehand also sort of a positive case of having a good public health system. So there again, I'm wondering how much we see of things that have pre-developed, antecedent developments playing out now, and are they on display now, so to speak, also from a comparative perspective. And yeah, coupled with that, my final point was, what do we see happening now and moving forward with regard particularly to these vertical and horizontal dimension of cooperation and federations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jared. So the floor is open. A lot to chew on here. Greg, go ahead.
Thank you. and apologize for the delay. Just want to say that there's two types of change. One is sort of the formal constitutional institutional change. For various reasons, I don't think this crisis is going to trigger that kind of change in the immediate term. Constitutional change in particular is very difficult in Canada for a host of reasons. But I think it lays the groundwork for some longer term changes. Enid mentioned the possibility of there being some kind of a royal commission looking at fiscal financing. And it is absolutely true that while provincial governments hold an enormous amount of power, the local governments hold very little. In the case of health and social services, there's a asymmetry. In Ontario, local governments do a lot more than they do in most other provinces. In most other provinces, that has been very much centralized in terms of the provincial order of government. But there are all kinds of vertical fiscal imbalances that need to be addressed, and particularly for local governments. This may spur that. In terms of long-term care, there may be some major changes through inquiries, et cetera, but these are going to be more in the area of 5 to 10 years. I also think, however, that there has been a breakdown in terms of some of the pan-Canadian or national institutions. The role of the Public Health Agency of Canada, that needs to be, in a sense, re-examined, and perhaps a larger role afforded it than has been displayed in this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rupak, I have you next on the list.
Thank you. As people making their presentations and the whole issue of emergency powers, Francesco wrote a piece recently where he essentially surveyed what has happened around emergency powers in federations across the world, and I think came to the conclusion that most have muddled through without invoking special emergency powers. But in the balance between uniformity of policymaking and the issue of subsidiarity, I wonder, and again, this is a question I'm wondering aloud about, whether the centralized federations, or the more like Australia, or the more integrated federations like Germany, have responded better to the crises, where on the one hand, you've had better coordination in terms of national policymaking, but at the same time, as things have evolved, more and more responsibility has been devolved to the lower orders of government. So first question. The second question is whether or not we're likely to see greater centralization in the immediate future, especially in the context of the collapse of subnational revenue, where one can see more and more higher order governments, particularly the federal governments, using their spending powers to impel lower order governments to fall in line on a range of nationally formulated policies. So these are just questions and thoughts I'm raising. Perhaps the panelists have some views on this.
So are there any thoughts on this? Sabine?
Well, I think that the integrated model of federalism was able to react rather quickly to the challenge of the virus. It could have happened faster, in my opinion, because there were some days and some of the Länder had to go ahead in order to make the others follow. So there were some days which were lost, probably. But on the other hand, I think it was really an advantage to see how the bodies of intergovernmental relations, how they were quickly able to take over the tasks. So I think whenever it is rather institutionalized, it can be an advantage to react in this crisis. And on the other hand, concerning the question, is it more an asymmetric response, which we are now observing at the moment of the lender to the crisis? I think the lender will soon return to the path of joint decision making, because they need to negotiate about who is financing the programs and the packages. And whenever it comes to fiscal relations, it is strongly entangled. So these tasks are really entangled. So I do not expect a new path of federalism, or a federalism which is shaped by more shared rule in the long term. So I think it's the lender will return quickly to the path of joint decision making.
Thank you very much. Since we are already very short on time, I am going to move on a little bit to some of the audience questions. There were a lot of different questions, but I want to flag one particular question that sort of raised its head in repeated ways. And that is one that explores the relationship between the central government and the local or the state governments, in particular, the imbalance between capacities and resources on the one hand and the responsibility on the other. We have some perspective from Brazil here that highlighted this, but also people that flagged this as a problem in India, in the US, and Canada. We've heard even in Germany, for example, that the rules on spending, for example, might be problematic here. So I want to ask the panelists, how do you think this crisis has sharpened maybe this tension that's sort of inherent to federalism? What are the different responses that we have seen, and maybe what are the kind of responses that we will see in the future? Yes, Inet.
Yeah, I think it's not only about global health crisis, but also about unprecedented economic challenge. And we are going to see, very strained relationship between center and states in India because of various issues, like there's been loss of revenue for both center and the states. Then there's another problem regarding small and medium enterprise that is on the verge of extinction. Then the global and local supply chain that has been greatly affected, especially the demand side has been affected to largely. And then another issue will be that globalization, since it's on retreat, so the export industries, they are doomed, and there's less domestic saving. So it will lead to rising problem of unemployment, rising inequality, especially in case of India, because the maximum brunt of lockdown has been borne by those who occupy the lower strata in society, the casual daily wage laborers, migrant laborers, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Enid.
Thank you. Well, I think I raised this issue in the context of Canada. If you take the taxes paid in Canada, 45% go to the federal government, 45% to provincial governments, and 10% go to local governments. So if you take all the taxes and divide them up among the levels of government. When the Constitution of 1867 came out, the British North America Act, it put health and education at the provincial level. And at the time, those weren't big expenditures, but as we know, those are now the fastest growing expenditures, particularly healthcare. And so you've got a division of responsibilities that is not matched by the division of revenue sources. And again, it's particularly true at the local level, because again, the local level is providing all these frontline services out of property taxes and user fees. And I think, we've talked about redoing the fiscal, or talking about fiscal arrangements for the federal government and provinces, but I think this is the first time we're saying it's actually federal, provincial, and municipal governments that we need to be looking at. Because, if the federal government said, okay, well, we'll lower the income taxes a little bit so municipalities can levy an income tax, they can't actually do that without provincial permission. And so all three levels of government have to be involved in this conversation about whose responsibility are these services and how do we pay for them. And Greg is quite right. It's different across, the division of provincial municipal responsibilities are different across the country. And what stands out quite dramatically is the field of social services, where 24%, almost a quarter of municipal expenditures in Ontario are devoted to social services. And again, paid for out of the property tax. So, you know, we at our institute have been calling for a who does what exercise at the provincial local level, you know, starting in particular with health and social services in Ontario, who should be delivering those services, who should be paying for them, and matching up both the responsibilities and the revenues. So I think what this pandemic has really laid bare is the structural problems that we have in our system. And I do think we have to rethink who does what, quite simply stated, who does what and who pays for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Alok. You're still muted, by the way.
Yeah, in India, there's a centralization of revenue collections and decentralization of responsibilities to the states and to the local level. It's about 50% of the revenues transferred, 41% to the finance commissions and rest of them from other sources. So the state government, they rely too much on the central government. But in this case, there's hardly any revenue collection. So there's going to be off-budget transfers through a banking routes and a couple of other things. The local government, they generally collects about 5%, barring few municipal corporations, the big cities. So they all depends upon the centralized revenue collection, that the GST and the custom duty, personal income tax, and corporate income tax. But there's hardly any revenue collections as of now. So what the central government is doing, they are just transferring resources, whatever was budgeted in the 2020-21 or so. So in a way, they are transferring resources, a kind of a borrowing in some terms. But I think if some kind of a crisis deepens, perhaps they have to go for some kind of a monetization. So which means the Reserve Bank of India or the central bank, they have to print more currencies for this. This just might be inflationary in the time to come. Just to kickstart the economy, because the small scale sectors, which generate maximum employment in the economy, they are just reeling as of now, reeling.
Great, that's really, so I think a lot of different federations basically deal with very similar struggles here. There is a lot more questions from the audience, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move us to the final reflections, because I think, you know, we should be done actually by now. So Professor Stadler, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, good evening to some of you. Thank you again for inviting me. This has been a very rich, informative, and very thought-provoking conversation that we've had. And I think the Forum Federation must be congratulated of bringing people together across 3 continents, 4 continents, to share ideas. Just 1 or 2 issues about, you know, what is similar and themes that run through the 3 countries. I think, you know, I don't know who selected the 3 countries, but they're probably the best examples, the cherries in federal practice of getting coordination done. You had leadership in the states, you've got good cooperation with the federal government. We didn't hear too much of conflicts and disputes, and you know, the end result, one was say, well done, federalism. Yeah, it's harmony, there's teams working together, and here and there perhaps a dispute. But I don't think one should then test federalism as a system against these good examples. Already Greg was mentioning the US next door, where there was just this harmony. But the question is, has federalism there failed? The argument would be no. it was precisely because of federalism that you could have a check and balance between the federal government and the states. And so there's various ways of assessing whether the federal system actually dealt with the pandemic in an appropriate and effective manner. And it can both be through cooperation or serving as a check and balance. The second theme that runs through the case studies is the notion of differentiation, that the infection is and the mortality are different in different places. It clearly then calls for different approaches. And the question is then, how do you manage this differentiation? I think the easy one in terms of federal government stepping in, but not necessarily in these cases, was the clampdown. Now, the difficulty of relaxing, easing the regulations or the constraints, who must take the leadership? And I think Sabine was talking about the shift of responsibility. Because the real tough question now is who makes the call between lives and livelihoods, and who's going to get it right and who's going to get it wrong. And I think there will be a trend to allow states, subnational governments to do that call. But having this differentiation and different levels, different states functioning, making calls, I hear also a bit of competition coming through in all three countries. Political competition, but also competition in a good sense. Bavaria leading the restrictions and others following. In India, Karnataka, I think, was the first state there that imposed restrictions, and others followed. So the healthy competition about what they thought at that time is the correct approach. What we then also see is now the opening up. Is this a competition to the bottom? Who can make it the easiest or quickest and therefore not take responsible steps? Yeah, I think political parties, it's something that's mentioned, but I think should come out much more fully. How have political parties approached this? I think in all three cases, there was great unity at the beginning. Yes, we'll have to stand together on this, but as the process works on, where there is social tensions, where the cost of the economic cost of the clampdown has becoming so significant, then I think there is a movement coming through of, say, political parties not breaking ranks of national unity, but they would come up with different areas. What I liked in all three countries is the strong role of local government, which has been almost the unsung hero. And I think Enid really brought it strongly to the fore, is that this is where the hardship and the restrictions is to be implemented, where people's on the street or haven't got food, haven't got livelihoods, and local government have to step in. And then, of course, the financial crisis that emerges from this will continue for some time. The other interesting sort of common theme was the role of intergovernmental structures. Were those that existed beforehand, could they simply step up? And it seems to be in these cases that was the case. They were, in fact, made more frequent, met frequently, and became a real source of organization. In many other countries, these intergovernmental forums were certainly sidelines. New institutions were created, often excluding subnational governments. But there's also some examples of, institutions emerging which didn't exist before, some institutions that are supposed to provide coordination and cooperation was certainly sidelined. And I think the one mentioned in Canada about the medical health officers that they're supposed to work together and provide leadership with sidelines. So there are common themes that run through, and I was then asking what was missing. Are there other themes that should be mentioned? And it just one can do so from a distant perspective. I think one thing I don't think is missing, but it was there, is what are going to be the consequences of this change. Already we talk about the constitutional moment. What is that going to mean? Will it be only constitutional moment, changes in the constitution, or policy changes? Although this pandemic, a pandemic was predicted, I think Bill Gates made this prediction of a real health pandemic 5 years ago. Nothing happened to it. Nothing happened. But now that we have this reality, something clearly will change, will have to change. This is not just speculation, this is not prediction, this is now reality. And what we also hear is this is not the last pandemic. With increased globalization, it is likely to occur again. And whether and how governments are going to change it, whether in countries are going to change the constitution to that effect. I don't think I hear anything that this was really going to happen clearly, or whether it can be a systemic one in the fiscal system, whether it changes, whether there can be shift in allocation of taxes, requiring a constitutional amendment, that has to be seen, but and that then you may have very different perspectives on it. I think the big question would be is how the economic effects of the pandemic is going to be felt, not only this year, next year. How long will the recession that in many countries are now present will last, and whether that is going to change our federal system systems in a way in which, if you have to deal with the economy, it's going to be centralized, and whether that becomes a more, if you look at the ultimate outcome of this pandemic. Let me leave you with those few thoughts. I think we had a good and a long session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really great. We had a lot of different themes, and you managed to somehow combine it all into one cohesive whole. That is really great. I also want to thank everyone again for your great contributions. Thank you to the audience for all the interested questions. We have some final concluding comments from Sabine and Rupak. So I want to say thank you again, and I open the floor to you two.
So, well, talking about the future, Nico mentioned it. I think hopefully this is not the last time we meet, and I hope instantly that we can continue this exchange of views and expertise. I really love to hear the different perspectives, and I found it thought-provoking and a lot of food for thought. So thanks to all the presenters and discussants, also to the audience for participating and asking questions, and many thanks particularly to John Light and Christoph Nguyen, Felix Knüppling for organizing the seminar and for the constant help. We give you a clap, so also you cannot listen to that. Thank you. And I think it would be great to share news, opinions, work on these issues. So send out opinions, reports, and documents whenever you have got something which is interesting to us. I would also like to share our work in the future. And well, I think Rupak, the floor is yours now to say goodbye.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I want to echo everything you've said in terms of thanking everyone. And also to repeat what Nico has said, my wife is an immunologist, and she tells me there are 200 virus families, but we have only, we so far have the capacity to deal with only 12 of those virus families in terms of treatments. So yeah, the next pandemic is just around the corner. But thank you everyone for coming together. And again, thank you Felix, John, Christoph, for organizing and putting all this together in the background. I think the seminar has provided us much food for thought. I know there are various streams of research that are ongoing within various groups, ISCFS, as well as other universities and other groups. From our side, there are two issues that I was particularly interested in, both personally and institutionally. One is the whole issue of the impact this is going to have on fiscal federalism, and what does this mean for economic revival in the longer term. And the second one is the whole issue of where local government fits into this and the importance of local government. And you can be sure that these are two themes that I'll come back on to the people here to see how we might do further work on this, because I think these are absolutely sort of defining themes of our times, not just on this issue, but on a range of on a larger scale. So thank you very much, everyone, and let's stay in touch and share information as we go along. And I'm sure we'll get together once again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.